Okay, everybody, welcome to this episode of the Israel Defense and Diplomacy Forum podcast, or IDDF as we like to call it. I'm Benjamin Anthony. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the MirYam Institute, and I'm delighted to be hosted here by Professor Chuck Freilich, a former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor, a professor at Tel Aviv University, a professor at Columbia University in New York. He's a long-time former fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard University, and he is also a contributor at INSS in Tel Aviv. We're going to hit 2-3 different topics today, but before we get into all of that, Chuck, just tell me how you're doing.
I am doing pretty well, surviving the end of August. It's always a hard time in Israel, and actually getting prepared to spend a semester in New York.
Wonderful. So let's actually talk about that semester. So the IDDF podcast, the program that we're recording now, we're actually going to be taking that show on the road a little bit. We're going to be seeking to bring about live events in the United States of America during the fall semester, this upcoming fall semester. What do you think people can expect to hear from us?
Well, I think there are a number of issues that will be of great interest in the coming months. First of all, unfortunately, is Israel's domestic crisis, which may hit a new low and a potential, just a really severe constitutional crisis, which pits the different branches of government against each other. That can happen in the course of September or October, certainly. And then we'll have, of course, the Iranian issue is always with us. And we'll see if there's progress, looking now at happier things, progress towards a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal with U.S. backing, really a trilateral package, even four-sided if you take the Palestinians into account.
Yeah, and I think that on all of those issues, people can expect to hear from us a series of disagreements and then agreements, but we'll do it respectfully and we'll do it out of that shared commitment that I know we have towards a prosperous future for the Jewish state and the Jewish people. And I'm looking forward to meeting people, to talking to people, and of course, to taking and responding to live questions from the audience. So if anybody wants to inquire about bringing the IDDF show live to their communities, whether it's a campus or a synagogue or a community center or elsewhere, they can just email us at info@miryaminstitute.org and we'll work it from there. So Chuck, with all of that having been said, let me start off with a little bit of a curveball, because Yevgeny Prigozhin, who headed a mutiny against Russian forces between June 23rd and 24th of this year, was on the passenger list of a private jet that crashed over Russian skies yesterday, killing all 10 passengers. All 10 passengers were reported dead, and unsubstantiated reports claim that Prigozhin's body was recovered and identified. So, Chuck, I assume this surprises you to no end. Am I right?
Well, I think maybe the only surprise is that he lived for as long as he did following the attempted coup. The specific modality maybe was a surprise, but Mr. Putin seems to have been very creative in this area over the years. A number of people met a early demise using polonium, a nuclear-related mineral, and others have remarkably fallen from porches, outside windows. There have been a variety of mechanisms. He seems to be a creative man. I think this shows his desperation to put down and deny any signs of internal unrest. The war is increasingly unpopular in Russia. A lot of people actually are still quite supportive because of the narrative that they hear, but among the elites, there's growing criticism. And any sign of dissent is something that he wants to put down. I don't know. What do you make of it?
Well, I'm not surprised. I agree with you that it is somewhat surprising that it took this long for Prigozhin to meet with his demise. I will say that there's plenty of fodder, unfortunately, for conspiracy theorists who are already starting to say that he may have orchestrated or choreographed this situation, Prigozhin that is, because he might have an impetus to fake his own death in order to survive and escape the pursuit of Vladimir Putin. So we'll see how much that earns on the conspiracy theory channels. But quite frankly, this could be seen, right? The moment an individual turns his tanks back towards Moscow and turns his troops towards Moscow, he's only going to meet one end, and this seems to be it. So I just wanted to get your view on it because it's a topic that everybody who is concerned about Israel is watching. Obviously, the Ukraine-Russia war, and this is a major story in the context of that war. So though it doesn't touch upon the subject of Israel directly, indirectly, I know this will be of high interest, and I appreciated your context there and your perspective there. And so with that having been chatted about a little bit, I want to turn to something that really does affect us, if that's okay with you. And that is the debate that took place for the Republican nomination. And it took place yesterday evening, New York time. And on that debate stage, there was one individual who stood out from among all of the others. Now, that debate stage had known commodities upon it. Those included Chris Christie, former governor of New Jersey. They included former Vice President Mike Pence. They included former ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, and, of course, Ron DeSantis of Florida. But there was also a much younger individual by the name of Vivek Ramaswamy. And Ramaswamy, who's a biotech entrepreneur, he's an individual whose political star is currently rising as he seeks to become the Republican nominee. He recently said, Chuck, that Israel should not get more aid than its Middle Eastern neighbors after the year 2028, which is when the current MOU expires. And he expressed that once Israel becomes, and I'm quoting here, more integrated with its neighboring countries, it should be able to, again quoting, stand on its own 2 feet. Now, here's where I'd like you to pick up on this subject, because, Chuck, to me, this type of language seems to echo the drumbeat for reciprocity that President Trump would regularly thump out over the airwaves and during speeches on foreign policy, not about Israel necessarily, but with regard to NATO, with regard to South Korea and elsewhere. I'm sure you recall all of that very, very well. This type of language also has overtones of the language we all heard from candidates who were vying to become the nominee for the Democratic Party in the run-up to the 2020 elections, who called for military aid to Israel to be conditioned and adjusted in accordance with Israel's policies in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. I'm referring to people such as Beto O'Rourke, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Pete Buttigieg. Now, most concerningly, this type of language speaks to a fundamental misunderstanding of the dynamic attendant U.S. aid to Israel, including the percentage of that aid that is spent on and earmarked exclusively for U.S. military hardware. And, Chuck, it underlines a long-held concern that I have, which is as follows. Many people, including you, but you're by no means a lone voice on this issue, many people have said that Israel must forever remain a bipartisan issue in the United States of America. We've seen a marked downturn in pro-Israel support in the United States. I would argue we've seen that in most pronounced fashion on the Democrat side of the aisle. But I have a longer-term concern. Not that Israel will become a partisan issue, but rather that Israel is going to lose its bipartisan support. It will then become a partisan issue for a period of time, and then it will return to being a bipartisan issue with very little support on either side of the aisle. Bipartisan by dint of the fact that it enjoys little support on either side of the aisle. That's my concern. What do you say to all of that? I know that was quite a lead in to my question, but I'd really like you to weigh in.
Well, I think you've raised a whole variety of important points here. I was very, very concerned by his statements, and I was hoping that they would not come up in the debate, which they did, and he restated those positions, and Nikki Haley, unsurprisingly, lashed out at him for it. Look, I think we're at an inflection point in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which, to my way of thinking, is one of the absolutely critical pillars of Israel's national security. Now, it's not so much the monetary value of the aid. And of course, it would be foolhardy to belittle the value of nearly $4 billion in aid, 3.8 something to be precise. But it's not so much the money. If Israel had to, we could live without that. It's about 1% of the national budget, about 3%, excuse me, of the
defense.
Not the GNP, the GDP. It's about 1% of the GDP, 3% of the national budget. Now, if we had to cut the budget by 3%, that would be a lot. You'd hear the various ministers screaming and shouting, but it's not something that couldn't be done. It's, of course, a huge share of the defense budget because it all goes to that. But again, if the national budget had to be cut, we could cover the cost. That's not the really critical part of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. The critical part is all sorts of things that go way beyond it. And yes, of course, it is access to the most advanced weapons. Theoretically, we could buy them from some other country, but nobody else has the weapons that the U.S. does. It's about strategic planning to meet all sorts of different contingencies. What did we do back in the day about the Iraqi nuclear program, the Syrian nuclear program? What do we do to counter terrorism? What do we do to promote the peace process? What do we do to deal with the Iranian issue today? Hezbollah, Hamas, everything. It's joint exercises, in some cases multilateral exercises. Now, each year, about a half a dozen European and even Arab countries participate in these exercises. It's the U.S. Ongoing help over the years to promote Israeli ties with countries in the region and beyond, and leading to the breakthrough, the Abraham Accords, and in the past, Egypt and Jordan, and hopefully in the not too distant future, I don't think it's going to be immediate, but with the Saudis and others, I said joint exercises, it's sharing of expertise, it's intelligence cooperation. Israel's intelligence community would be infinitely poorer without the cooperation with the U.S. By the way, this is an area where we also have a lot to offer. It's cooperation in the cyber area. It's in a whole variety of areas. And one particularly critical area, of course, is the U.S. veto in the Security Council. If it wasn't for that, Israel would have been the subject of international sanctions decades ago, including for our purported strategic capabilities, which is another way of saying Israel's purported nuclear capabilities. Now, when you hear already, as you were saying, in 2020, some prominent Democratic candidates talking about making aid conditional, and a number of, let's say, Democratic-friendly public experts, leading public experts. There's two former ambassadors to Israel, Dan Kurtz and
Aaron David Miller
and Martin Indyk. And yes,
thank you.
Right.
Aaron David Miller and Martin Indyk tend to be of one mind on this issue.
And and they've written a number of pieces together. You're absolutely right.
Thank you.
And you hear them actually already coming out and talking about making aid conditional. And now you hear it beginning to hear it on the Republican side, which, well, it's the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, but it's not just there. There are doubts. By the way, there are legitimate doubts. Okay, Israel is, by world standards, a wealthy country. We don't think of ourselves in those terms, but we've got a national standard of living, which is a mid-European level, similar to Britain and France. That's not bad. We maybe shouldn't be a beneficiary country of foreign aid. Like, this is all military aid, of course. It's not economic aid. There are a lot of other countries out there in the world where people are starving. You can make the case that the U.S. should be giving aid to them. Those are all legitimate arguments. The problem, though, is that, to my way of thinking, what's really motivating the change we're seeing is I think, an impending crisis, or maybe it's not even impending anymore, because on the left, Israel has become a toxic topic. And I'm afraid that that's going to happen increasingly on the right as well. Still, support is very strong on the right. As a matter of fact, overall American support is still quite strong. But it's not what it once was. I don't think we'll ever see a France 1967 turnabout, the U.S. turning its back on Israel. But I think we're seeing the beginning of the erosion of what was until now just a rock solid basis. And it'll take a few years, and I'm afraid of where we'll be at that point.
Yeah, just to talk out some of those points that you made, of course, I'm somebody who believes that it's actually in Israel's interest to, first and foremost, diversify its sources of military aid. Israel's not receiving any foreign aid or any financial aid from the United States of America, as you just said. Just a quick question for you, by the way, a quick yes, no. Do you think that these candidates actually understand that this is military aid necessarily versus financial aid? Because there's this phrase of let Israel stand on its own 2 feet. That has overtones of as almost being a client state financially. Do you think that he fully understands this is military aid earmarked for US military hardware and material? In the most part, at least.
Yes, I think they absolutely do. But it's still foreign aid to Israel. Okay, it's money that the U.S. is taking, almost $4 billion a year, which it is giving to Israel. This is military. It could have been civil. It's still foreign aid.
And you think that they understand that this is obviously a jobs program that gets spent back on the defense contractors there in the United States of America. Do you think that's fully understood, Chuck? Really, you do?
Well, I mean, all American foreign aid is contingent on it actually being spent in the U.S. So they could give it to some very poor third world country and get the same benefit to the American taxpayer in terms of creating jobs.
Well, in any event, these other aspects, I would argue, have been on the wane for some time. I believe it was UN Resolution 2334 that was not vetoed, that really gave Israel a kick in the teeth at the exit points of the Obama administration. I believe that was in November of 2019, perhaps. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And I remember it was on Hanukkah, and everybody expected that the US would veto it. Of course, they did not veto it. In fact, many people said that they were active behind the scenes in crafting the resolution. That was something that we heard. And I don't really know. In fact, I'm going to say I don't agree with the idea that the toxicity towards Israel that's manifested on the left is the result of Israel's policies or an impending crisis. This has been coming for decades, and I actually place the blame squarely at the feet of institutions of academia on North American campuses. I think that for far too long, they have been teaching a misreading of the history of Israel. For far too long, they've been deliberately and wantonly inculcating young minds with falsehoods about Israel. I think that they have been receiving, we're talking about foreign aid, let's talk about foreign investment, massive foreign investment from the Saudi Arabian kingdom and from elsewhere that really does distort the entire story of Israel. And now these bright young minds that have been at preeminent universities in the United States of America, some of which you teach at or have taught at, are affixing their gaze upon elected office. And guess what? With them, they are bringing an anti-Israel agenda or animus towards Israel, not because Prime Minister Netanyahu is seeking judicial overhaul here in the State of Israel, something that's only been going on really since he came back to elected office in recent months, 8-9 months ago, whatever the count is, but rather because this is what they've been taught, this is what they have been told, and this is basically the accepted tone, tenor, and content of the conversation when it comes to America's policy towards the State of Israel. Do you disagree with that?
Well, I don't disagree that there is an anti-Israel onslaught on campus. I mean, it is very, very clear and prominent. We might disagree on the sources of that. It's been going on for decades. It started building in the post-67 years, and especially, let's say, by the late 70s. And I believe this is where we'll disagree. I believe that it is overwhelmingly because of the West Bank / Palestinian issue. And I don't think that we can remedy the situation other than, first of all, by recognizing that that's the problem, and second of all, addressing the issue.
So I don't believe that. This is my last point on this, and then we'll pivot to our second subject, which I know that you're going to enjoy talking about and speaking out with me. But I do not think it's to do with our policies in Judea and Samaria. I'll tell you what I think it is. I think it just took a little bit of time before the international community felt comfortable with slamming Jews again after the Holocaust. I think that was not something that they were able to do in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. I think that was not something that they were able to do at the founding of the Jewish state. But I think that once they saw that this people, the Jewish people, were able not only to coalesce, not only to repel threats, but actually to be positively strong and stood a real chance of thriving in the reconstituted state of Israel, at that point, across that timeline, from 1948 to 1967, they did not feel comfortable attacking Israel, because who would want to do that after what had befallen the Jewish people? But by 1967, enough time had elapsed for people to say, you know what, let's have at them again. They're fair game. We've got a basis to criticize them. Let's go for it. But that's my view. I don't think it was a policy, because the policy is an unfolding policy and a gradual one. Let's turn to another subject, Chuck. And it's actually a subject that I think probably you, above and beyond anyone else in the world, perhaps, is able to speak about. And it's the publication of a new book that I want everyone to go out and to purchase. This book is called Israel and the Cyber Threat: How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power. Now, you have a relationship with the author of this book because you are that author. And I read with great interest a review of the book that was published in jns.org, penned by Yaakov Lapin. And in his conversation with you, you say that the number of, and by the way, I'll put a link to that article in the show notes here for anyone who wants to read it. You say, Chuck, that the number of startups in Israel equals the total number of cyber startups in the world, excluding the United States of America. And then in a direct quote of you, Yaakov wrote, "This is a stunning statistic. It's the result of a really unique contribution to the Israeli high-tech scene in general, and the cyber realm, especially by the defense establishment and intelligence agencies." You go on to say that graduates of the Israel Defense Forces cyber units, mainly Unit 8200 and Unit 81, as well as intelligence agencies, enter the private sector and become a primary source of commercial startups. Now, Chuck, first of all, you're a glutton for punishment. You're always writing books. I don't know quite how you do it, but congratulations again. We've spoken about this book a couple of times before on this podcast. I really would encourage everybody to go out and purchase this and read about it and learn about this fascinating subject, because it's a good news topic out of the state of Israel. We're hearing so much that's bad. This is a great, great news topic. So let me ask you a quick question. We hear a lot about these two units that you mentioned in that article, Unit 8200 and Unit 81. I would say we hear more about 8200 than 81. Could you please tell us exactly what these two units do?
Well, if I told you exactly what they do, then neither one of us would possibly be walking around as free men for very long. But 8200 is Israel's version of what's called the National Security Agency in the United States, the NSA, the primary signals intelligence agency, and actually today they're mostly a cyber agency rather than signal. Unit 81, which you correctly said is spoken of less, because there's really very little information about them in the public domain. There's more about 8200, but it's the advanced technologies unit in military intelligence. These are the guys who come up with all sorts of crazy, brilliant technological solutions to all sorts of intelligence problems. I have a friend who is a fan of James Bond movies, and he says that 81 is really the equivalent of Q in the James Bond series.
Well, pay attention, Mr. Bond, if you would. Do you remember that phrase of Q? No, it wasn't even Mr. Bond. It was pay attention, Bond. Do you remember?
Of course.
So I want to ask you a subject that you may be a little bit surprised by as I do so, with regard to the cyber developments that you spoke to Yakov Lapin about in the article I referenced. So in 2014, the MirYam Institute, actually its precursor, Our Soldiers Speak, which then morphed into the MirYam Institute, we brought to the USA to lecture Brigadier General Rachel Tevet Wiesel. Now, Rachel Tevet Wiesel was the advisor on gender affairs to the then Chief of Staff, Benny Gantz. And what had caught her focus in that role was that the selection of soldiers for a position in Israel's cyber units skewed very far towards men. The reason for that was not discriminatory towards women in any way whatsoever. The cause of that was simply that male children exhibited far greater interest in all things high-tech at a generally earlier age than did female children. And Rachel's concern, again, Rachel being this brigadier general in the IDF, her concern was that the result of that societal phenomenon was that women were not exposed to tech and cyber opportunities in the IDF as a consequence, and they did not meet, therefore, their startup partners in the cyber realm as a result of that. And they simply did not have the same openings to cyber and high-tech careers as did the men. Do you know if that's changed at all? And the reason I'm asking you that is that you made mention in this article to the fact that the compulsory military service of the IDF constitutes what you called the secret sauce behind the success. And you argued that that is what enables the IDF to track down the best and the brightest with the military scouting high school databases and actually begin to locate those best and brightest as early as 10th grade in high school. So if male high school students are more inclined toward tech than female, do you think that there's going to be any opportunity for greater parity there? Do you see this as an issue? Do you see it as a non-issue? Do you know where this stands now? Rachel Tevet Wiesel was concerned about it in 2014. Here we are almost a decade later.
Well, it's certainly a problem. I don't think it's a problem that's unique to Israel. Men seem to be more interested in STEM, in the science, technology, and engineering topics, math, than women. The numbers are changing slowly around the world, and maybe not so slowly in some parts of the world, but it is a global phenomenon. And if you believe, as I do, that our primary source of success as a country in general, certainly in the business and high-tech areas and in the military areas, is the human contribution. Israel's really remarkable human resources, male, female, whatever. This country is an incredible well of human creativity. And so if there is an imbalance like that, it means that we're not using our female manpower, to misuse the word, to the extent that we should be. Now, I do know one number that I remember by heart of one of the units. I believe it's the unit that trains the offensive cyber attackers. And they were quite happy that they had raised the number of trainees to 12% women, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a pretty abysmal figure, but it was higher than they had a couple of years ago. The only good news, so to speak, in this picture is that not just the IDF, but the government as a whole are aware of this, and there are all sorts of outreach programs for women at all ages, for for girls in school. There's a program called She Girls, which exposes them to cyber and other things. And there's a mentorship program where female programmers and other cyber experts in various high-tech firms contribute some of their time to mentor female students who show some interest in this. There are programs specifically designed to bring Haredi, ultra-Orthodox women into this area. So an attempt is being made, but the imbalance is still there.
And it's a good news story, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up in this episode, because, listen, it's a heavy time here in Israel at the moment, but not all things are doom and gloom. However, I'm not sure that I would be in adherence to my Jewish character and nature were I not to add a little bit of pessimism to this story, because investment in Israeli cyber firms is down. It's down, some say, as much as 40%. What's accounting for that, Chuck?
Well, there's a decrease around the world this year, a downturn in investment in high tech, and specifically in cyber. But to that, you have to add the judicial reform crisis, which has scared away a lot of investors. They don't want to invest in a country which is in the midst of a domestic crisis, and specifically a domestic crisis which is perceived, whether one agrees or not, but is perceived to threaten Israel's basic character as a democracy. Investing in less than democratic states is risky. And I think even if this crisis is resolved in the near future, and that doesn't seem to be the case, it will at best, I think, be a few years before we can make up for the lost ground. And it's not clear that one can ever make up this kind of lost ground. It's a matter of image. It's a matter of how you're perceived in the world. And even, let's say, over the last couple of decades, when Israel's global image on the one hand was very bad, well, because of the Palestinian issue and some other topics, on the other hand, it was branded as the startup nation, and people respected it for that. And here, one of the negative outcomes of this reform process is that we've undermined that image through our own hands.
So one last question on this topic, and it's a foundational question. When you and I first started collaborating at the MirYam Institute, you were in the midst of completing one book, and it was a heavy, heavy task for you to complete that. And then I thought maybe you'd take a break from writing books, and all of a sudden I hear that you've launched into and close to completing the book that's now available for purchase, the one that I mentioned about Israel's cyber capabilities. What made you want to write this book?
Well, first of all, there is a disease that I came down with at a very young age, and some call it graphomania, but my wife will attest to the fact that when I'm not writing, I'm grumpy and not as much fun to be around. So there was always that. But actually, it was a product and outgrowth of the previous book on Israel's national security strategy, which had, I think, in total, maybe about 5 pages about cyber. And I said to myself as the book came out, hey, this is a really interesting area that I know nothing about. And that's how it came about.
Well, I'm very pleased that it's there. And at some point, we're going to do a full episode just on that book. I want to now turn to another subject, Chuck. I want to turn to Saudi-Israel normalization, perhaps as the final topic. We'll see how we do in terms of time. Now, within this mooted US brokered, to be US brokered, Saudi-Israel normalization, there is much talk about the Saudi desire for a defense pact with the United States of America. And what that talk has generated is much talk about whether or not Israel should enter into or seek or bring about a defense pact with the United States of America. Now, this subject is not new. It seems to be a pulsing subject when it comes to national security priorities for the State of Israel. But I'm on a conversation with a former Deputy National Security Advisor. I'm reading, as I'm sure many of our listeners and viewers are, multiple viewpoints about the pros and cons of a defense pact between Israel and the United States of America. Give us of your expertise. Talk to us about 3 pros, 3 cons, and then let's flesh that out a little bit. And I want you, please, to, before doing that, I want you to do that other thing that you have to do as a Deputy National Security Advisor, which is step into the Saudi shoes, channel the Saudis, if you would, for us, which is incumbent upon you in the roles you've previously played. Tell us why the Saudis want that defense pact. And I want you to do that very briefly, because I really want you to spend the bulk of the time on the pros and cons for Israel.
The Saudis have always been dependent on the U.S. for their security. There was an implicit deal for the last three quarters of a century. The Saudis would ensure a relatively stable, relatively reasonably priced supply of oil, in exchange for which the U.S. would guarantee their security. And in the first Gulf War in 1991, the U.S. indeed intervened, not really because of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, but because they were afraid that Saddam would continue into Saudi Arabia if not stopped in Kuwait. So the U.S. saved Saudi Arabia at the time, and the second Gulf War was also significantly about defending Saudi Arabia. But in the last 20-odd years, the Saudis have become increasingly less convinced of the ongoing American commitment to their security. And they've also been very disappointed and disenchanted by the way the U.S. has handled a number of critical events in the region in the last 20 years, whether it's the war in Iraq, it's the Arab Spring, it's attacks against them by the Iranians and their proxies, or attacks against the UAE. And so we've seen them starting to hedge in the last few years, also turning to the Chinese, maybe turning to Israel, because they were less confident in the U.S. commitment to their security. Here, what they're trying to do is formalize an American buy-in to them, and they know that the U.S. really wants the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and so they've presented a number of very, very difficult demands. I would be quite surprised if the U.S. agrees to give them a formal security treaty. The U.S. hasn't done that for any country since Japan in 1961. So it's a very tall order when you're talking an authoritarian regime, and one which has actually become reviled in the United States in recent years. But maybe a lesser commitment can be worked out, or maybe a limited defense treaty. It won't guarantee their security in every case, but in some cases, I don't know what they'll do to address the Saudi demand here. Israel has had an on and off interest in an American defense treaty. Ben-Gurion looked at it in the 50s because he was really afraid at the time about how to ensure Israel's survival. The Eisenhower administration was not interested. There was no buy-in at all. There was no real discussion, if any. A few prime ministers, Rabin, Peres, and Barak, looked at it, and I just saw recently, and maybe Sharon as well, but certainly the first 3 looked at it as potential American compensation, so to speak, were Israel to sign a peace treaty with the Palestinians or with Syria at the time. So a way to placate, allay the fears of the Israeli public in a situation in which it would be withdrawing from significant and strategically important territory. So it's to allay the concerns and demonstrate American commitment. And Netanyahu actually raised it in, I believe, the previous election about 2 years ago, raised it for a couple of weeks, and it didn't gain any traction, so he dropped it. Okay, first of all, full disclosure, I think, just about the only person in the Israeli defense establishment over the years who's taken a favorable approach towards the possibility. And that's a little bit surprising because most countries would give their right arm to have an American defense treaty. The U.S. has a good record. It's not perfect, but it has a good record of living up to its treaty obligations over the decades. And this would be a huge transformation in Israel's strategic circumstances, to have the United States guaranteeing our security. Now, frankly, and again, as someone who supports the possibility under certain circumstances, not unquestioned support, we don't need it today for military reasons. And the only circumstances in which I could see Israel needing it for military reasons is partly if Iran goes nuclear. I think we can handle a nuclear Iran through deterrence. Yes, it would be nicer to have an American guarantee to back it up, but not. I think we can handle it with our own deterrent capabilities. If as a result of Iran going nuclear, the region as a whole starts going nuclear, we see the Saudis, the Turks, and Egypt being the likely proliferators. Actually, Turkey may be first, the likely proliferators if Iran goes nuclear. A Middle East with multiple nuclear powers is simply a nightmare situation. I don't think there's any real way to address that effectively. And an American guarantee won't solve the problem for Israel, but it would be very helpful in those circumstances. There are other reasons why we might want it militarily. It will strengthen Israel's deterrence. It will put Israel in that very select group of close American allies who enjoy an American security guarantee and what's called extended deterrence. In other words, the U.S. is bestowing its deterrence on Israel. The counter arguments, there are two or three primary ones. There are a bunch of others. The first and most important one is maybe a fear that Israel would lose its freedom of maneuver because a defense treaty requires that you consult with the other side. And then we'd need American support, at least quiet acquiescence for whatever we do. Now, here I say, first of all, it's been decades since Israel has done anything of consequence without first consulting with the U.S. And consulting actually very often means asking for permission, even if you don't put it in those terms. And my solution to the problem is to say, well, let's limit this treaty just to existential threats. We don't need the U.S. for Hezbollah, for Hamas. The only situation in which we might really want the U.S. is what I said before, nuclear Iran, certainly a Middle East with multiple nuclear powers.
And what you've just described, so people are familiar with a bit of the jargon, that would be termed, there's a U.S.-Israel Defense Pact, and then there's what's called a narrow defense pact, and that would be very, very defined to circumstances such as those you just delineated. Carry on, Chuck. I just wanted people to be clear on it.
Good clarification. The second concern is that the United States might demand that Israel divulge and even dismantle its purported nuclear capabilities. Now, this is a possibility, and if it happened, my response would be immediately to say, "Oh, thank you, no, thank you, and see you sometime in the future." I don't think that the U.S. This is a big if the U.S. is willing, excuse me, if the U.S. is willing to enter negotiations with Israel on a defense treaty, I don't think they would raise a demand which they know would be an absolute non-starter. Might they demand some further clarifications from Israel, some additional assurances about the way Israel handles this? That's a possibility. I don't see them demanding that we go that far. There's an issue of what this would mean for Israel's national ethos of defending itself. But those are the primary things.
So, Chuck, let's talk about this idea of consultation. You made mention of the idea that consulting with the United States of America is basically de rigueur at this stage. And you went further than that, and you said that seeking permission from the United States is de rigueur. So I want to get into a specific example, and you tell us where you think this would fit within the pro-con cost-benefit analysis that you just put forward. And that was an attenuated cost-benefit analysis. I know that we could discuss this in much greater depth, but let's take a specific example. In 2007, all of a sudden, lo and behold, the Israeli defense establishment discovers that basically right under its nose, not in Tehran, but in Syria, there is a nuclear weapons facility under construction that has essentially been brought over there through intelligence, know-how, capabilities from North Korea. The blueprint of this was found during a Mossad raid in Vienna, I believe. And then Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who had a very good relationship with then President of the United States, George W. Bush, traveled to Washington, D.C. to beseech the American president to take military action, for America to take military action against this nuclear facility inside Syria. And George W. Bush, who by any estimations was a great friend of Israel, not just in a good relationship with Ehud Olmert, but a good friend of the State of Israel. Incidentally, a faith-based friendship towards the State of Israel to no small degree.
Absolutely.
He said, the solution to this must be diplomatic. We need to take this to the Security Council, and that's the path that we're going to take, diplomacy. And only thereafter did Ehud Olmert decide on unilateral action by the States of Israel. Incidentally, to take our listeners a little bit more behind the scenes, when Olmert went to ask George W. Bush for America to tackle this issue, the then head of the Israeli Air Force, Major General Eliezer Shkedi, who was the son of a Holocaust survivor, told me in an interview that I conducted with him that he did not think that that was appropriate at all. He felt that when Israel faced an existential threat, the lessons of his father looming large, the lessons from the Holocaust of his father looming large, the State of Israel need not ask nor consult with anybody at all, especially when they have the capability to tackle this issue. By the way, I should emphasize, Eliezer Shkedi also says that only Ehud Olmert would have had the courage to then do what was eventually done, which was to defy the advice of the United States of America and to launch this unilateral strike led by the Israeli Air Force. There were other options considered, such as sending in special forces to detonate the facility and any number of other things. And then afterwards, after this operation was concluded, which I believe was called Operation Arizona, perhaps?
Orchard.
Operation Orchard, and the code word for a successful strike and destruction of the facility was Arizona, right? I believe it was, we have Arizona. So once this was done, Ehud Olmert contacted George W. Bush, and he said, I just want you to know, I'm paraphrasing here, but I understand it's a pretty reliable paraphrasing. He said, I just want you to know that that thing that was once there is no longer there. So you've got this incredible dynamic here. Where would something like that fit in? Would the action of Ehud Olmert, would that be something that could be undertaken by the State of Israel in the context of a narrow U.S.-Israel defense pact?
First of all, we have to add one stage to the narrative, which is that in the meeting between the prime minister and the president, when Bush said, look, the intelligence is overwhelming. We agree with you. This is a military nuclear program. But he also said after the Iraqi debacle, the U.S., he can't do it without a smoking gun. Now, there's a difference between, let's say, an intelligent smoking gun and a smoking gun that you can present to the public, which sometimes demands a level of proof which simply cannot be presented for reasons of classification or for whatever. And that's when he said, well, we're planning on doing X, Y, Z as you presented. And Olmert said to him, well, Mr. President, if that's the case, the state of Israel will have to do what it has to do to defend itself. And the president said, yes, I understand exactly. You will do what you have to do. Now, I think that's about as close as one gets to a green light from a superpower as one could ever expect. So superpowers don't let allies, they don't give them a green light to go and launch major military operations. This is a case where actually, I mean, you can play it in two ways. You can say, well, would it have limited our freedom of maneuver here? And I think no. Certainly once the president said, no, you have the right to self-defense. A defense treaty does not negate your authority to go ahead and protect yourself. The defense treaty is designed to commit the other side to helping you. Maybe. Look, people also say if a president really doesn't want to live up to a treaty commitment, he'll find a way to get out of it. Well, again, the U.S. has an imperfect but really good record when it comes to that. Bush would have had a very hard time not living up to it. But remember, I said that my primary motivation for being interested in this is not the military reasons. It's another reason, a political one that I'll come to in 1 minute. And I said militarily, I think we could only really need it in one of two situations, maybe if Iran goes nuclear, and certainly if we start seeing a number of nuclear powers emerging in the region. I tend to think that we can handle a nuclear Iran, I said this before, through Israel's own deterrence, but of course it would be very nice to add American deterrence to it. I mean, there's certainly... Look, we haven't implemented the so-called Begin Doctrine to date against Iran. We did it against Syria, the story that you told. We did it, of course, for the first time against the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981. And everybody, since the Iranian nuclear program emerged, became a public issue in the early 90s, so it's already 30 years, everybody's been waiting for Israel to launch the Begin Doctrine against Iran. It hasn't happened. And the reason it hasn't happened is maybe because we can't do it. Maybe the Begin Doctrine has run its course. And some people argue, by the way, that let's say the Stuxnet virus, the attack on the Iranian nuclear program, other purported Israeli cyber and kinetic attacks against Iran may be a new form of implementing the doctrine. So it's not that we haven't tried, but we haven't succeeded yet. But we may not be able to do it. We may still do it. We may not be able to do it against Iran. If you think about Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, and Egypt, and that's the likely order of proliferation after Iran. Well, Turkey's a NATO partner. There's no way we can attack Turkey. Saudi Arabia, even without the discussion today about a defense treaty with U.S., has been an American protectorate, so to speak, or a country defended by the United States. It would be kind of hard to attack them. And Egypt has certainly been a close American ally for decades. It would be very hard to attack them. So again, maybe the Begin Doctrine has run its course and Israel cannot take military action against these programs. And then having American deterrence would, of course, be very, very beneficial if that's indeed the case. The real reason that I would like us to reach a defense treaty is because of what we were talking about before. It's my fear that we are heading towards a crisis in the relationship. And one of the ways of ensuring its long-term vitality is by having a defense treaty. Now, the defense treaty won't cover the problems. And it's not something that I think we'll get for free. There are no free lunches. It would only be given to Israel in rather unique circumstances. Maybe if the U.S. has to do it for various reasons and they have to do it with the Saudis, well, it would be hard to say no to Israel in those circumstances. But I think that it's more likely that this would be part of a peace deal with the Palestinians, or it would be in exchange for an end to military aid to Israel. It's okay, we'll end the aid, but we'll give you that. Circumstances such as that.
Well, I appreciate you speaking about your motivations for that and your support for some sort of a US-Israel defense pact, defense treaty. I think that helps to clarify much of what's on the minds of people who are looking on at this subject with great interest. We'll wait and see, but I want to we only have a couple of minutes left. The context you provided with regard to the conversation between Olmert and Bush was an important layer of context. So thank you for adding that in. But do you not think that were we to see a president who was, let's say, less friendly or more adversarial towards the states of Israel, do you not think that in the context of an existing US-Israel defense pact, were a president to say, under similar circumstances, no, we do not want you launching a strike against that nuclear facility, let's say in southern Lebanon, just as an example. And I'm sorry to drag us into hypotheticals, but it's relevant to the subject we're speaking about. Don't you think that a US-Israel defense pact, in the context of which a president says, do not strike, don't you think that pact would prevent us from doing what Olmert did and saying, well, we have to do what we have to do?
Well, in the end, every country bears responsibility for its defense. And in the way that I said before, that there's no absolute guarantee that a president would live up to it. I mean, that applies for all sides. But the counter side to the not unrealistic scenario that you're presenting is that the president would be bound by the treaty. And he would be more constrained than the Israeli side would be here. But again, I think we're reaching a point. I said we've, at least when it comes to the nuclear threats. Again, I don't want this for Hezbollah. I don't want it for Hamas. We don't need to have our hands tied there. I don't think the U.S. wants to get to dirty its hands with this kind of stuff. Okay, it's at a level that's below the interest of a global superpower. And it would create all sorts of problems for them. They don't need it. That's why I'm saying let's limit it to the existential threats, where I think that we've reached the limit, or we're nearing the limits to our own capability to deal with them. Remember, Iran alone is a regional superpower. Okay, it's a country of over 80 million people. By regional standards, well-educated, sophisticated. They're very tied into what's happening in the world. They're avid users of the internet. One of Iran's biggest exports today, by the way, fortunately for us, is they're exporting scientists. A smart, sophisticated country. It's not the bunch of loonies that they appear to many of us when we look at some of their policies and the way they state them. If Iran wants to go nuclear, they're going to sooner or later. And by the way, they've got the capability today. It's just a political decision to do it.
Yeah.
Now, then the U.S. either responds militarily or it doesn't. And we respond militarily or we don't. No one can eliminate their nuclear program anymore. At best, it can be set back by a couple of years because they have the know-how and they can rebuild. So in those circumstances, you might want to, I mean, if you can't solve the problem on your own, I don't know anyone who thinks Israel can solve the problem. The only argument is whether we have a capability to even set it back in any substantial manner and at what price. Yeah, you might want the commitment.
So I'll just make a couple of additional points to that, and then we'll probably wrap chat just because of the time limits. The first one is this idea of pushing a nuclear program back by a few years. So I have long held the opinion that I don't think anybody knows. And I take the two examples that you made mention of as evidence for my belief that if it's within our capabilities to strike, and if the outcome of that is best case scenario, we roll back the program for a few years, unlike that which most people say, therefore we shouldn't bother doing it because it only buys us a few years. I say, look at the track record. The track record says something completely different. The track record says that when we went and detonated the Iraqi nuclear program in 1981, the Iraqis, despite the blaster of Saddam Hussein, they never, ever stood up a nuclear weapons program again. When we went and detonated the Syrians in the Syrian nuclear reactor, in 2007, all of a sudden they became embroiled in a civil war. There were challenges that absolutely tore that country asunder, and I don't see them coming anywhere close to reestablishing a nuclear weapons program. So it looks to me like buying a few years in the Middle East is buying a few years in the most uncertain part of the world, and it would look as though there isn't this rapid return to just gearing back up again a nuclear weapons program, but rather it can knock things back for decades.
I have to disagree with you on that point before you raise the other points that you wanted to make. First of all, the Iraqis did stand up a nuclear program. And of course, in 91, the U.S. then destroyed it. In 2003, it turns out that the intelligence was false and they didn't have a nuclear program. In 91, they absolutely did. And it's not that in 91 they had it actually already a few years earlier. So the attack on the Iraqi reactor did buy us a few years, certainly less than a decade. And
but you agree that when Saddam Hussein was blustering and talking about having a nuclear weapons program, this was nonsense. By the time that the U.S. went in the invasion of Iraq, yes, there was nothing there. There was nothing there whatsoever.
But in 91, there was an entire nuclear program. And also the Iranians learned from the Iraqi program and they diversified it. So it's all over the country. That's one difference. And in terms of the Syrians, there have already been some reports in the last few years, maybe 3 years, that they have begun to try and reconstitute the program. Whether those reports or not, I don't believe that if they haven't, that they won't start soon. Maybe they were too preoccupied with the civil war. If I was in the intelligence community today, I'd be looking under every rock in Syria.
Well, that's alarming, and I'm sorry that I've brought you to having to.
Well, there's so much good news. Right?
I know. Well, there's one last point I want to make about this defense treaty.
Okay.
I think many people are very concerned about the possibility that. And we see this. We do see some evidence of this. You remember that you and we participated in a webinar at an early stage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine with Ambassador Cameron Manta present on that conversation, on that webinar. And he expressed that because there was some unhappiness about the lack of commitment on the part of Israel, that Israel might be pulled onto the carpet to do more in the future with regard to arming Ukraine, assisting Ukraine. I wonder if we might see a situation in Defense Pact where there is some sort of a suggestion, and I know that this concerns many people, that IDF troops might have to deploy overseas in support of a U.S. security consideration or foreign policy initiative. Now, that would be a massive concern domestically. I don't think that there is any mandate for anything like that whatsoever among the Israeli electorate. But how realistic do you see that concern as being, Chuck?
Well, a defense treaty is a reciprocal agreement. Both sides undertake to support the defense of the other side. Now, last time I looked, the U.S. is just a tad bigger than we are, so no one expects this to be reciprocal, but not symmetrical. Look, this is a problem that all American treaty partners face. Do we really want to be tied down by this kind of a commitment on our part? The Australian and New Zealand treaties, for example, limit their liability, so to speak, to their general theater of operations. In other words, they're not committed to intervening in Europe or various other parts of the world. And if you look at what was done in Afghanistan, was done in Iraq, was done in Vietnam back in the day, different countries responded in different ways. Very few sent combat troops. It's actually only the UK, which usually does, and the Australians. And others send maybe a medical team or a logistics team or a communications team. And I think that's what would happen with Israel. We could say, no, we're not sending combat troops. Yeah, we will have to send a medical team or a cyber team or this team or that team. But I think it is a concern, but that's one that we can address in the way that
that's a very important perspective. I cannot see that there would be any popular support whatsoever for the deployment of Israeli combat troops to any military theater other than one that's decidedly a priority for the states of Israel itself, even to the exclusion of everyone else. Well, Chuck, like you said, there's so much good news. Everything's wonderful over here in the Middle East. It's great to talk to you again. Thank you so much for this conversation on the IDDF podcast. And with that, Chuck, all the very best. I wish you a restful weekend and a Shabbat Shalom. And it's been a pleasure once again.
It has been a pleasure as well, I must say, and Shabbat Shalom.
Cheers, Chuck. All the best.